The devil's cold breath swept across the desert that night, turning sand to ice and hope to despair, as Harriet Vega lay abandoned among the scrub and stone, counting each heartbeat as possibly her last. The December chill penetrated her threadbare dress, her teeth chattering a desperate rhythm as darkness enveloped the vast emptiness surrounding her. Betrayed, robbed, and left to die by men she'd mistakenly trusted, Harriet curled into herself, the bruise on her temple throbbing in time with her fading consciousness. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life in California had led her west after the death of her parents in Boston. At 22, Harriet had sold what little remained of her family's possessions, purchased passage on a westbound train, and set her sights on teaching in one of the frontier towns sprouting across the landscape. Her education and refined manners were to be her salvation, but naivety had proven her downfall when she agreed to share a stagecoach with 3 men claiming to be merchants headed to Porterville. They'd taken everything: her money, her luggage containing her letters of introduction, even the locket with her mother's portrait, before striking her across the head and tossing her from the coach like discarded refuse. Hours had passed since then, and the temperature continued to plummet in the high desert night. "This is how it ends," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Not in Boston with dignity, but alone in the wilderness." The sound came distantly, at first the rhythmic drumming of hooves against packed earth. Harriet forced her eyes open, uncertain if her mind was fabricating hope in her final moments. A lantern's glow appeared on the horizon, bobbing with the movement of its carrier. She tried to call out, but her parched throat produced only a rasp. With the last of her strength, Harriet pushed herself to her knees, waving weakly as the rider approached. Her vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges as the silhouette of a man on horseback materialized from the gloom. "Hello!" The deep voice carried a note of surprise. "What in God's name?" The horseman dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. Tall and broad-shouldered, his face remained shadowed beneath his wide-brimmed hat as he approached cautiously. "Miss, are you hurt?" Harriet tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her body had reached its limit and she pitched forward. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. The last thing she registered was the scent of leather, tobacco, and horse as the stranger gathered her against his chest. "Stay with me now," he urged, his voice both gentle and commanding. "I've got you." Consciousness returned to Harriet in fragments, the rhythmic motion of a horse beneath her, the solid warmth of a man's chest against her back, an arm securely around her waist. Then stillness, followed by being carried. The crackling of a fire came next, its warm glow penetrating her eyelids before she could open them. She lay on something soft, a bedroll spread near a small campfire. A heavy coat covered her, trapping blessed warmth against her frozen limbs. Harriet blinked slowly, orienting herself to her surroundings. A small, neat camp had been established in the lee of a rock formation that blocked the worst of the wind. The fire cast dancing shadows across the desert floor and illuminated the face of her rescuer as he crouched nearby, stirring something in a small pot. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. Dark hair curled from beneath his hat, and a short beard framed a strong jaw. When he turned toward her, she was struck by eyes the color of the sky at dawn, a clear, piercing blue that assessed her condition with concern. "You're awake," he said simply, setting aside his cooking spoon. "Thought I might lose you there for a while." Harriet attempted to speak, but her throat constricted painfully. The man immediately reached for a canteen, moving to her side with surprising grace for his size. "Easy now," he cautioned, slipping an arm behind her shoulders to help her sit up. Small sips. The water was life itself, cool and sweet against her parched throat. She drank greedily until he pulled the canteen away. "Not too fast," he warned. "Your body needs time." "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once, settling her back against his saddle, which he'd positioned as a pillow. "Name's Patrick Vance. Most folks call me Pat." "Harriet Vega," she replied, clutching his coat closer around her shoulders. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Vance." "Pat," he corrected. "And staying alive would be thanks enough. What in God's name were you doing out here alone after dark? These parts aren't forgiving to anyone, least of all a woman on her own." The memory of her ordeal crashed over her, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. "I was robbed. 3 men. They took everything I had and left me to." She couldn't finish the sentence. Pat's expression darkened, his jaw tightening beneath his beard. "Which direction were they headed?" "West, I think. Toward Porterville," he nodded grimly. "That's where I'm headed come morning. Got a small ranch just outside town." He returned to the fire, ladling stew into a tin cup. "Think you can manage some food? It's nothing fancy, just beans and jerky, but it's hot." The simple meal was the finest thing Harriet had ever tasted, warming her from the inside as she ate slowly, savoring each bite. As strength returned, so did her awareness of her situation alone in the wilderness with a stranger, however kind he might seem. "What will happen to me now?" she asked quietly when the cup was empty. Pat took it from her hands, his fingers rough with calluses but gentle in their movement. "I'll take you to town tomorrow. Sheriff Dawson's a good man. He'll help track down the men who did this." He hesitated. "You have family in Porterville?" Harriet shook her head. "No one. I was coming to take a teaching position, but my letters of introduction were in my trunk." "Teaching?" He looked surprised. "You're educated then?" "Boston Ladies' Seminary," she confirmed, a hint of pride entering her voice despite her circumstances. "I taught there for a year after graduating." Pat nodded thoughtfully. "Town's been trying to get a proper school going for a while now. Mostly it's just Mrs. Miller teaching the little ones in the back of the church." He added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the vast canopy of stars. "You should rest. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." As he moved to spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, Harriet was struck by his consideration. "Mr. Vance, Pat," she corrected herself. "I've taken your coat and your bedding. Where will you sleep?" The hint of a smile touched his lips, softening the hard planes of his face. "I've slept on harder ground with less cause, Miss Vega. The coat's yours for tonight." "Harriet," she offered, feeling a strange need to establish some equality between them. "Harriet," he repeated, and something in the way her name sounded in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Get some sleep. We've got a long ride ahead tomorrow." Sleep came swiftly, dragging her into blessed oblivion, but not before she registered the vigilant silhouette of her rescuer against the star-filled sky, his rifle resting across his knees as he kept watch through the night. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light stretching across the desert floor, illuminating the harsh beauty of the landscape. Harriet woke to the aroma of coffee brewing over a rekindled fire. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was she? Why did every muscle in her body ache? Then memory returned, along with the sight of Patrick Vance attending to his horse a few yards away. He'd removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing corded forearms tanned dark by the sun. He worked methodically, checking the animal's hooves and adjusting the saddle, his movements confident and practiced. Without the shadow of his hat, she could see his profile more clearly: a straight nose, high cheekbones, and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to determination than smiles. As if sensing her gaze, he turned, catching her watching him. Rather than looking away, Harriet offered a tentative smile. "Good morning." "Morning," he replied, returning to the fire. "How are you feeling?" "Alive, thanks to you." She pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. "Though I believe I've discovered muscles I didn't know existed." The corner of his mouth twitched. "That'll happen when you spend a night on the desert floor." He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "It's strong enough to stand a spoon in, but it'll help with the aches." The bitter brew was indeed powerful, but the heat and caffeine were welcome. As she sipped, Harriet became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her dress was torn and dirt-stained. Her hair had fallen from its pins, and she could feel the grit of sand against her skin. Yet Pat treated her with the same respect he might show a proper lady in a drawing room. "I must look a fright," she murmured, attempting to smooth her tangled hair with her free hand. Pat glanced up from where he was packing his cooking equipment. "You look like someone who survived what would have killed most city folk," he said matter-of-factly. "Nothing to be ashamed of in that." His simple statement restored some of her dignity, and Harriet straightened her shoulders. "How far are we from Porterville?" "About 4 hours' ride if we push it. Longer if we take it easy." He assessed her condition with a practiced eye. "Given your state, I'd say we take it slow. No sense rushing just to have you fall off the back of my horse." "I'm stronger than I look," she countered, finishing the last of her coffee. Pat nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "I don't doubt it, but there's no shame in pacing yourself either." After a quick breakfast of hardtack and jerky, Pat helped Harriet to her feet. The world tilted alarmingly for a moment, and she gripped his arm to steady herself. His solid presence anchored her as the dizziness passed. "All right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yes, just a moment of weakness." She released his arm, conscious of the impropriety of clinging to a man she barely knew, despite the circumstances. Pat didn't comment, simply offering his cupped hands to help her mount his horse, a sturdy palomino with intelligent eyes. Harriet placed her foot in his hands, and with a swift, controlled motion, he boosted her up onto the saddle. After gathering the last of their supplies, he swung up behind her with effortless grace. "Lean back if you need to," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. "No sense in exhausting yourself trying to sit straight as a board the whole way." The intimacy of their position, his chest against her back, his arms encircling her to guide the horse, would have scandalized proper Boston society. Yet here in the vastness of the desert, such concerns seemed distant and irrelevant compared to the practicalities of survival. As they set out across the desert, Harriet found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. What had seemed barren and hostile by night revealed itself to have a stark beauty in the morning light. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the sky, and in the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty. "It's beautiful in its way," she observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Most folks only see what's missing out here: trees, water, people," Pat replied. "They don't see what's actually here." "And what do you see?" He was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer carefully. "Freedom, space to breathe, land that doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." There was something in his voice, a depth of feeling that suggested a story behind his words. Harriet found herself curious about this man who had saved her life, who spoke sparingly but with quiet intelligence. "Have you always lived in these parts?" she asked. "No, came west after the war, didn't much care for what Virginia had become." The slight drawl in his speech became more pronounced as he mentioned his home state. "You fought for the Confederacy." She couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "I fought because Virginia called her sons home," he corrected, a hint of old bitterness coloring his words. Didn't own slaves, didn't believe in the cause, just did what was expected like most men. His arms tensed slightly around her. That's something that matters to you. The question hung between them, carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Harriet considered her answer carefully. My father was an abolitionist, she said finally. He believed in equality for all men, but he also taught me that every person deserves to be judged by their own actions, not by which side of a line they happen to be born on. She paused. You saved my life, Mr. Vance. That tells me more about your character than which uniform you once wore. The tension in his posture eased slightly. Fair enough. After a moment, he added, Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, she agreed, a familiar pang of loss tightening her chest. He and my mother both died of influenza last winter. That's part of why I came west. Too many memories in Boston. Pat nodded, understanding in his silence. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, the heat of the day building around them. He stopped occasionally to offer her water from his canteen, watchful of her condition. By midday, they paused in the shade of a large boulder, and Pat helped her down from the saddle. Need to rest the horse, he explained, though Harriet suspected the stop was as much for her benefit as for the animals. As they shared a meager lunch of the remaining jerky, Harriet found herself wondering about the life that awaited her in Porterville. Without her letters or the small savings she'd carried, how would she establish herself? The thought must have shown on her face. Something troubling you? Pat asked, his keen eyes missing little. Just wondering what happens when we reach town, she admitted. I have nothing, no money, no references, nowhere to stay. Pat considered this, brushing crumbs from his hands. Town has a small hotel. Mrs. Rodriguez, who runs it, is a good woman. She might let you work for your room until you get settled. He hesitated. As for the teaching position, I know Reverend Miller's been trying to organize a proper school. Worth talking to him. The practical suggestions eased some of her anxiety. You seem well respected in Porterville. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I mind my business, pay my debts, and help when needed. Out here, that's enough to earn respect. As they prepared to continue their journey, Harriet noticed Pat scanning the horizon with a watchful intensity that hadn't been present earlier. Is something wrong? She asked. Dust cloud to the west, he replied, helping her back onto the horse. Could be nothing. Could be riders. Either way, I'd rather reach town sooner than later. His caution transmitted itself to Harriet, and she found herself watching the distant horizon as they rode, looking for the dust cloud he'd mentioned. The peaceful rhythm of the morning gave way to a more alert, purposeful pace. Pat guided the horse along what seemed to be a dry creek bed, keeping them lower than the surrounding terrain. Are you concerned about the men who attacked me? She asked after some time. Would be foolish not to be, he answered honestly. 3 men desperate enough to leave a woman to die might not take kindly to her showing up alive in Porterville. The blunt assessment sent a chill through her despite the desert heat. Do you think they'll recognize me? Depends how close a look they got at you and how much attention they pay to newcomers in town. His arms tightened slightly around her, a reassuring pressure. But they won't be expecting you to have help, and that gives us an advantage. The idea that this man, this stranger who owed her nothing, was already positioning himself as her protector touched something deep within Harriet. She'd been independent out of necessity since her parents' deaths, priding herself on her self-reliance. Yet there was comfort in knowing she wasn't facing this ordeal alone. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Pat didn't respond verbally, but she felt him nod, his chin briefly brushing against her hair. As they approached Porterville, the landscape gradually changed. The bare desert gave way to scattered farms with irrigation ditches drawing precious water from a distant river. Fields of young crops stretched in neat rows, and occasional trees provided welcome shade. After hours in the open desert, the signs of civilization felt almost jarring to Harriet. Porterville itself appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the main road, with scattered houses and farms surrounding it. It wasn't large by Eastern standards, but to Harriet, after the emptiness of the desert, it represented hope. "Not much to look at," Pat commented as they approached, "but it's growing. New buildings going up every month, and the railroad's supposed to reach us by next year." "It looks wonderful to me," Harriet replied honestly. After her ordeal, the sight of any town was beautiful beyond measure. As they rode down the main street, Harriet was acutely aware of curious glances from townspeople going about their business. A woman riding double with Patrick Vance, disheveled and clearly not from around these parts, was evidently something of a spectacle. She held herself as straight as her aching body would allow, clinging to what dignity she could muster. Pat guided his horse directly to a small building with a sign declaring it the Porterville Sheriff's Office. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Harriet down. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground, and Pat steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "All right?" he asked quietly. "Yes, just stiff from riding," she assured him, though in truth, exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her again now that they had reached relative safety. The sheriff's office was simple but orderly: a desk, a few chairs, and 2 cells at the back with iron bars. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s with iron gray hair and a weathered face that had seen its share of troubles. He looked up as they entered, surprise registering in his eyes as he took in Harriet's condition. "Pat," he greeted, rising to his feet. "Wasn't expecting you back in town until next week." "Change of plans, Sheriff Dawson," Pat replied. "This is Miss Harriet Vega. Found her abandoned in the desert last night, about 15 miles east. 3 men robbed her and left her to die." The sheriff's expression hardened as he looked at Harriet with new understanding. "Madam," he said, pulling out a chair for her, "why don't you sit and tell me what happened?" For the next half hour, Harriet recounted her story from boarding the stagecoach in Tucson to being discovered by Pat. Sheriff Dawson took notes, asking occasional questions about the men's appearances and what had been stolen. These men said they were continuing on to Porterville. The sheriff confirmed when she had finished. Yes, they claimed to be merchants with business here. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Pat. "Any new faces in town the past day or so?" Pat asked. 3 men checked into the hotel yesterday afternoon. Claimed to be buyers for a mining company, looking at local claims. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. One had a fancy Eastern accent like Miss Vega described. "That's them," Harriet said with certainty, a mixture of fear and anger rising within her. "They're here in town. Last I saw, they were drinking at Donovan's saloon," Sheriff Dawson confirmed. "I'll bring them in for questioning, but Miss Vega, I should warn you it'll be your word against theirs unless we find your belongings in their possession." "I understand," she said, though the prospect of facing her attackers was daunting. "She needs rest before anything else," Pat interjected, noticing how Harriet's hands had begun to tremble slightly. "And a safe place to stay," the sheriff nodded. "Best take her over to Mrs. Rodriguez at the hotel. I'll handle these men for now. Get a look at what they're carrying, maybe search their rooms if I can get cause." Pat helped Harriet to her feet, his hand steady at her elbow. "I'll come back to help once she's settled," he told the sheriff. Outside, the afternoon was waning, the sun casting long shadows across the dusty street. Harriet found herself leaning more heavily on Pat's arm than she'd intended, her strength flagging after the long ride and emotional strain of recounting her ordeal. "Just a little further," Pat encouraged, shortening his stride to match her slower pace. "The hotel's just down the street." The Porterville Hotel was a two-story wooden structure, its whitewashed facade and green shutters standing out among the more utilitarian buildings surrounding it. A sign in the window advertised clean rooms, hot meals, reasonable rates. The interior was simple but welcoming, polished wooden floors, a small lobby with several chairs, and a reception desk where a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled into a practical bun was sorting mail. She looked up as they entered, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Harriet's condition. "Dios mío," she exclaimed, coming around the desk. "What has happened?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Miss Harriet Vega," Pat explained. "She was robbed and abandoned in the desert. I found her last night and brought her to town." The woman's warm brown eyes filled with sympathy. "You poor child. Come, sit before you fall." She guided Harriet to a chair, then turned to Pat with a businesslike efficiency that suggested their acquaintance was long-standing. "She needs a room, food, and hot water for washing. I will arrange everything." "She also needs work," Pat added. "Miss Vega lost everything to the thieves, including the money for her lodging." Mrs. Rodriguez studied Harriet for a moment. "You are educated, yes, I can tell by your speech." "Yes, madam. I came west to take a teaching position." The hotel keeper nodded decisively. "Then it is settled. You will stay here and help me with the accounts and correspondence. My English writing is not so good for business letters. In exchange, you have a room and meals until you are on your feet." The generosity of the offer brought tears to Harriet's eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing. Only rest and get well." Mrs. Rodriguez turned to Pat. "I will take care of her now, Patrick." "You have done your good deed." Something in Pat's expression, a reluctance, perhaps caught Harriet's attention. He seemed unwilling to leave, despite having fulfilled his duty in bringing her safely to town. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he said to Harriet, his voice gruff. "After the sheriff and I deal with those men." "Be careful," she urged, suddenly afraid for him. "They're dangerous." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "So am I when necessary." He tipped his hat to her. "Rest well, Miss Vega." As he turned to leave, Harriet called after him, "Patrick." He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you. For my life." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them before he nodded once and departed, leaving Harriet with the strange certainty that their paths were now inexorably intertwined. Mrs. Rodriguez proved to be as efficient as her manner suggested. Within an hour, Harriet found herself in a small but clean room on the second floor, provided with a basin of hot water, soap, a borrowed nightgown, and the promise of a hot meal once she had refreshed herself. The simple act of washing away the desert dust felt like a rebirth. As Harriet cleaned her face and hands, combed the tangles from her hair, and changed into the borrowed nightgown, she began to feel human again. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand was pale and bruised, but her eyes held a determination that surprised even herself. True to her word, Mrs. Rodriguez soon arrived with a tray bearing a bowl of hearty stew, fresh bread, and a cup of tea. "Eat, then sleep," she instructed. "Tomorrow is soon enough to worry about everything else." Exhaustion claimed Harriet almost as soon as she had finished her meal. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, her body and mind both desperate for recovery. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the small window of her room, and the sounds of the town going about its business drifted up from the street below. For a moment, the unfamiliar surroundings confused her. Then memory returned: the attack, the desert night, Patrick Vance's unexpected rescue, and finally, the arrival in Porterville. With the memory came concern what had happened with the sheriff. Had they confronted the men who attacked her? Harriet rose and dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Mrs. Rodriguez had somehow managed to clean and mend overnight. The simple act of buttoning her dress was a challenge with fingers still stiff from cold and exertion, but she managed, determined to present herself with as much dignity as possible. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Rodriguez in a small office behind the reception desk, frowning over a ledger. The older woman looked up as Harriet entered, her expression softening. "Ah, you look much better today," she observed. "How do you feel?" "Sore but alive," Harriet replied honestly. "Has there been any word from the sheriff or Mr. Vance?" Mrs. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "The sheriff arrested the men last night. They had your trunk in their room, just as you said. They claim they found it abandoned, but no one believes such nonsense." Relief washed over Harriet at the news that her belongings had been recovered. "And Patrick, is he all right?" A knowing look crossed the hotel keeper's face. "Patrick is fine. He helped the sheriff make the arrests. There was some resistance, but nothing he could not handle." She closed her ledger. "He asked about you this morning, said he would return later after he finished some business at his ranch." The thought that Pat had inquired after her welfare brought an unexpected warmth to Harriet's cheeks. She turned away, pretending to study a notice board on the wall to hide her reaction. "I should go to the sheriff's office. If they've recovered my trunk, I'll need my papers." "Eat first, Mrs. Rodriguez insisted. "I've kept breakfast for you." After a simple but hearty meal of eggs, beans, and tortillas, Harriet made her way to the sheriff's office. The town looked different in daylight, smaller than it had seemed the previous evening, but also more vibrant. People moved purposefully between the general store, the small bank, the livery stable, and other businesses. A few children played in the dusty street, their laughter a counterpoint to the serious business of frontier life. Sheriff Dawson was at his desk when she entered, writing in what appeared to be an official report. He looked up, nodding in greeting. "Miss Vega, good to see you on your feet. You're looking more yourself today." "Thank you, Sheriff. Mrs. Rodriguez told me you arrested the men who attacked me." "That we did." He gestured to the cells behind him, which Harriet now saw contained 3 sullen-looking men. "Found your trunk and papers in their hotel room, just like you said. They're claiming they found it abandoned, but the stagecoach driver confirmed he saw you board with these 3 in Tucson." One of the men, well-dressed, despite his current circumstances, glared at Harriet through the bars. "You'll regret this, miss," he said in the cultured Eastern accent she remembered all too well. "We have friends in high places." "Not high enough to keep you from hanging for attempted murder," Sheriff Dawson replied mildly, though his eyes had hardened. "Miss Vega, don't pay them any mind. I've sent for the circuit judge. He should be here within the week." "My belongings?" Harriet asked, trying to ignore the malevolent stares from the cells. "Right here." The sheriff indicated a familiar trunk in the corner. "Everything seems intact, including your money pouch." They hadn't gotten around to spending it yet, fortunately. The sight of her trunk containing everything she owned in the world brought a rush of emotion that Harriet struggled to contain. "May I take it now?" "Of course. I've recorded everything as evidence." Sheriff Dawson rose to help her, but the door opened before he could reach the trunk. Patrick Vance entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His gaze immediately found Harriet, a look of relief crossing his features when he saw her standing unaided. "Miss Vega, you're looking better today." "Thanks to you, Mr. Vance," she replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been with the sheriff. "I understand you helped apprehend these men last night." The hint of a smile touched Pat's lips. "Sheriff did most of the work. I just provided some." Encouragement when they considered resisting arrest. Sheriff Dawson snorted. That's one way to put it. Clancy there is still nursing the black eye you gave him. The smallest of the three prisoners scowled, the bruise around his left eye testament to Pat's encouragement. I was just helping Miss Vega collect her belongings, the sheriff continued. Pat, since you're here, would you mind carrying her trunk back to the hotel? My deputy's out making rounds. Happy to, Pat agreed, though his casual tone couldn't quite hide his eagerness to be of service. As he lifted the trunk with ease, Harriet felt a curious fluttering in her stomach at the prospect of spending more time in his company. It was inappropriate, perhaps even foolish, to feel such things for a man she barely knew, yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Outside, the late morning sun beat down with growing intensity. Pat adjusted his grip on the trunk. "How are you really feeling today?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Better," she assured him. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been very kind. She's offered me work at the hotel until I can secure a teaching position." Pat nodded approvingly. "She's good people. Everyone in town respects her." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "I spoke with Reverend Miller this morning, told him about your situation and your qualifications. He's interested in meeting you. The town's been collecting money for a proper school for months now." Surprise and gratitude warmed Harriet's chest. "You did that for me, without even knowing if I'm a competent teacher," the corner of his mouth twitched. "You strike me as competent at whatever you set your mind to, Miss Vega." The compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, pleased her more than flowery praise from any Boston gentleman ever had. "I hope to prove you right." As they walked, Harriet noticed several townspeople watching them with undisguised curiosity. A woman in a stylish dress outside the milliner's shop stared openly, her expression speculative as her gaze traveled between Harriet and Pat. "You're causing quite a stir," Harriet observed quietly. "Not me. You." Pat kept his eyes ahead, but she could see amusement in his profile. Porterville doesn't get many educated Eastern ladies, especially not ones with such dramatic arrivals. By sundown, half the town will have heard how I found you, and the other half will be inventing even more interesting stories. "Does that bother you?" she asked, suddenly concerned that she might be damaging his reputation. Pat shrugged, the motion shifting the trunk slightly in his arms. "People will talk regardless of what we do. Better to give them something worth talking about." They reached the hotel, where Mrs. Rodriguez directed them to take the trunk directly to Harriet's room. The narrow staircase required Pat to maneuver carefully, and Harriet found herself admiring the strength and grace with which he handled the awkward burden. In her small room, he set the trunk down at the foot of the bed, then straightened, suddenly seeming too large for the modest space. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly where it had been pressed against his head. "Thank you," Harriet said, aware of the intimacy of having a man in her private quarters, however innocent the circumstances, "for everything you've done." Pat nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "I'm glad I found you when I did." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner tonight. At the hotel dining room," he clarified quickly. "Just to make sure you're settling in all right." The invitation surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something building between them from the moment he'd found her in the desert, a connection that defied easy explanation. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice steadier than the sudden racing of her heart. Relief and pleasure crossed his face. "Good. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. After he left, Harriet sat on the edge of her bed, trying to make sense of her feelings. Patrick Vance was nothing like the men she had known in Boston. He lacked their polished manners and cultured speech. Yet there was a solidity to him, a fundamental decency that she found more compelling than any surface charm. With a shake of her head, she turned her attention to her trunk. Opening it revealed that the sheriff had been correct. Everything appeared intact. Her clothes, books, and personal items were all present, including the small pouch containing her savings. At the bottom lay the letters of introduction she had obtained from her former employer at the seminary. With these, she had a real chance of securing the teaching position Pat had mentioned. The thought of establishing herself in Porterville, of building a new life here, filled her with a mixture of anxiety and hope. It was so different from what she had imagined for herself. Yet perhaps that was exactly what she needed, a complete break from her past, a chance to define herself anew. With renewed determination, Harriet changed into her best dress, a modest navy blue with white collar and cuffs, and arranged her hair neatly. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror appeared more confident than she felt, but perhaps that was appropriate. In this new place, she could be whoever she chose to be. Her first stop was the church, a simple white painted building with a modest steeple. Inside, she found Reverend Miller, a kindly man in his 60s with spectacles and a scholarly air that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. He greeted her warmly. "Miss Vega, Patrick Vance told me about your ordeal. A terrible introduction to our town, but I'm glad to see you've recovered." "Thank you, Reverend. Mr. Vance mentioned you might be interested in establishing a proper school for the children of Porterville." The Reverend's face lit up. "Indeed. We've been collecting funds for months. The town is growing, and the children deserve better than the makeshift classes my wife has been offering." He gestured to the church's simple pews. "Would you tell me about your qualifications?" For the next hour, Harriet outlined her education and teaching experience. She produced her letters of recommendation, which the Reverend read with evident approval. By the time their conversation concluded, she had been offered the position of Porterville's first schoolteacher, with classes to begin as soon as a suitable building could be prepared. "It won't be what you're used to," Reverend Miller cautioned. "The salary is modest, and you'll have children of all ages and backgrounds in one room." "I understand," Harriet assured him. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and every child deserves an education, regardless of their circumstances." The Reverend smiled warmly. "Patrick said you had spirit." I see he was right. He offered his hand, which Harriet shook. "Welcome to Porterville, Miss Vega. I think you'll find our little town has much to offer despite its rough edges." The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions, as Reverend Miller insisted on taking her to meet several prominent townspeople, the mayor, who also owned the general store, the banker, and the editor of the small weekly newspaper. Everywhere she went, Harriet was met with curiosity, but also with genuine welcome once they heard she would be teaching their children. By late afternoon, she returned to the hotel feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Mrs. Rodriguez greeted her with knowing eyes. "I hear you are to be our school teacher. The children are fortunate." "The position won't start for a few weeks until the schoolhouse is ready," Harriet explained. "In the meantime, I'm still very grateful for your offer of employment." The hotel keeper waved a dismissive hand. "We will work it out. For now, you should rest before your dinner with Patrick." At Harriet's surprised look, she laughed. "It is a small town, Miss Vega. News travels faster than the stagecoach." Harriet felt her cheeks warm. "It's just a friendly dinner." "Mr. Vance saved my life. I owe him my gratitude." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression turned thoughtful. "Patrick Vance is a good man, quiet, keeps to himself mostly, works hard on that small ranch of his." She studied Harriet for a moment. "Not many people know his story. He doesn't speak of it often." Curiosity prompted Harriet to ask, "What story is that?" "It is not my place to tell," Mrs. Rodriguez replied firmly. "But know this, he has known loss, as have you. Perhaps that is why he recognized something in you worth saving." With that cryptic statement, she returned to her work, leaving Harriet to ponder her words. At precisely 6 o'clock, Pat arrived at the hotel dining room. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes, while still practical, were clean and pressed, and his dark hair was neatly combed. Most striking was the absence of trail dust that had covered him during their previous encounters, revealing the true handsome lines of his face beneath the usual weathered exterior. He spotted Harriet immediately, and something in his expression as he approached her table, a mixture of appreciation and uncertainty, sent a flutter through her stomach. This was no longer simply the man who had saved her from the desert. This was Patrick Vance inviting her to dinner like a proper suitor. "Miss Vega," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You look, well." The inadequacy of the word seemed to frustrate him, but Harriet understood what he meant to convey. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. So do you." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please join me." As he sat, she noticed several other diners watching them with undisguised interest. Pat followed her gaze and grimaced slightly. "I warned you about the gossips," he said quietly. "Let them talk," Harriet replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "I owe my life to you. Surely I'm allowed to thank you over dinner." A slow smile spread across Pat's face, transforming his usually serious expression. "When you put it that way, I suppose you are." The meal was simple by Eastern standards: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert, but prepared with care. Conversation flowed more easily than Harriet had expected, once Pat's initial reserve melted away. He asked about her meeting with Reverend Miller, listening attentively as she described her new position. "The Reverend mentioned that you spoke highly of me," Harriet said, curious about his advocacy on her behalf. "You barely knew me." Pat considered this as he broke a piece of bread. "I know enough. You survived something that would have broken most people. You maintained your dignity and grace through an ordeal that would have left others bitter and defeated." He met her eyes directly. "Character reveals itself in adversity, Miss Vega. Yours revealed strength." The simple sincerity of his assessment touched her deeply. "I could say the same of you, Mr. Vance. Not many men would have stopped for a stranger in the desert night, Pat," he reminded her gently, "and any decent man would have done the same. I think we both know that's not true." Harriet hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned you've known loss in your life. Perhaps that's why you recognized mine." A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment Harriet feared she had overstepped. But then Pat nodded slowly. "She's right in her way. I had a wife before I came west. Sarah. She died in the last year of the war. Typhoid swept through our town while I was away fighting." His voice remained steady, but Harriet could see the old pain in his eyes. "I came home to an empty house and a fresh grave. Couldn't stay in Virginia after that. Too many ghosts." The revelation of his past loss explained so much about him: the solitude he seemed to prefer, the watchful gravity in his eyes, the capacity for compassion he had shown her. "I'm sorry," she said simply, knowing no words could truly address such grief. "It was a long time ago," Pat replied, though they both knew such wounds never fully healed. "Life continues, whether we want it to or not." The conversation shifted to lighter topics. After that, Pat told her about his small ranch, where he raised horses and a few cattle, and Harriet shared stories of her teaching experiences in Boston. As the evening progressed, Harriet found herself increasingly drawn to this complex, thoughtful man who seemed so different from anyone she had known before. After dinner, Pat walked her up the stairs to her room, maintaining a respectful distance that nevertheless felt intimate in the narrow hallway. At her door, he hesitated, clearly wrestling with something he wanted to say. "I'd like to call on you properly," he finally stated, his directness both startling and refreshing after the elaborate courtship rituals Harriet was accustomed to in Boston. "If that would be welcome." The simple request, delivered without pretense or flowery speech, moved her more than an eloquent declaration might have. "It would be very welcome," she replied softly. Relief and pleasure crossed his features. "Good, that's good." He cleared his throat. "I need to return to my ranch tomorrow. There's work that won't wait, but I'll be back in town in a few days." "I'll be here," Harriet assured him, "beginning my new life as Porterville's schoolteacher." Pat smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that made Harriet's heart skip. "Good night, Miss Vega." "Harriet," she corrected gently. "And good night, Pat." After he left, Harriet leaned against her closed door, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. In the span of 3 days, her life had been completely transformed from desperate peril to unexpected possibility. And at the center of that transformation stood Patrick Vance, a man as unexpected and compelling as the desert itself. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Harriet established herself in Porterville. The building that would become the schoolhouse previously, a storage barn at the edge of town, was cleaned, repaired, and fitted with simple desks and a chalkboard. Families began registering their children for classes, revealing the diverse makeup of the frontier community. Farmers' children, shopkeepers' offspring, the son of the Chinese laundry owner, and even several Mexican and Native American children from families living on the outskirts of town. True to his word, Pat returned to town several days after their dinner, calling on Harriet with a formality that seemed at odds with his usual straightforward manner. They walked together through town, talking easily about the progress of the school preparations and his work at the ranch. When he left again, he promised to return the following week. A pattern developed. Pat would come to town every few days, sometimes bringing small gifts. A book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers gathered on the ride-in, once even a small carved wooden horse that he had made himself during the long evenings alone at his ranch. Each visit deepened their connection, revealing new facets of their personalities and shared values. News came that the circuit judge had arrived and tried the 3 men who had attacked Harriet. Their guilt proven beyond doubt, they were sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for robbery and attempted murder. The closure brought Harriet a profound sense of relief, removing the last shadow from her new beginning. The schoolhouse opened with 27 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. The work was challenging. Managing so many children of different ages and backgrounds required all of Harriet's skill and patience, but deeply rewarding. She discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed. An ability to explain complex ideas in simple terms, a knack for maintaining discipline without resorting to harsh measures, and a genuine delight in watching young minds awaken to knowledge. Throughout it all, Pat's steady presence in her life became something she counted on, looked forward to with an anticipation that grew with each visit. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the hotel dining room, and sometimes simply sat on the hotel's small porch in the evening, watching the town settle into night while discussing everything from books to politics to their hopes for the future. It was during one such evening, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Porterville, that Pat finally spoke of feelings that had been growing between them. "I'm not a man of many words," he began, his gaze fixed on the darkening street before them. "Never have been. But I want to be clear about something, Harriet." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight spilling from the hotel window. "I care for you, more than I thought possible after Sarah. If you don't feel the same, I'll understand. Your friendship alone has been a gift I never expected." The simple declaration, delivered without embellishment, touched Harriet deeply. In Boston, men had courted her with elaborate compliments and practiced charm, yet none had affected her as profoundly as Pat's honest admission. "I care for you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "At first, I thought it was just gratitude for saving my life, but it's become so much more than that. You're a good man, Patrick Vance, the best I've known." Relief and joy transformed his face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Pat reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they enfolded hers. "I don't have much to offer a woman like you," he said softly. "My ranch is small, the house plain. Life out here is hard, especially for someone used to Eastern comforts." "I'm stronger than I look," Harriet reminded him, echoing words she had spoken during their first journey together. "And what matters to me isn't the size of a house or the ease of a life, but the character of the person I share it with." In the golden lamplight, with the sounds of the small town settling around them, Pat leaned forward and kissed her a gentle, questioning touch that held promise rather than demand. When he pulled back, the wonder in his eyes mirrored what Harriet felt in her own heart. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Not out here, not anywhere." "Perhaps that's why it's precious," she replied, "because it was unexpected." The following Sunday, after church services, Pat asked Harriet to accompany him to his ranch. "I'd like you to see it," he explained. "To know what kind of life it would be before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Harriet understood the implication. Before their relationship progressed further, he wanted her to see the reality of the life he could offer her. Mrs. Rodriguez provided a proper chaperone in the form of her teenage niece, Alina, who rode with them in Pat's wagon. The journey took just over an hour, following a well-worn trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. As they crested a small rise, Pat's ranch came into view in the valley below. It was modest by any standard, a small but solid cabin with a covered porch, a barn and corral where several horses grazed, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden protected by a stone wall. Beyond the immediate homestead stretched fenced pastureland where cattle roamed in the distance. A creek ran along one edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade. "It's not much," Pat said, watching Harriet's face anxiously. "But the land is good and there's water year-round. The house, well, it needs a woman's touch, I suppose." As they approached, Harriet could see the care Pat had put into his home. The cabin was well maintained, the yard swept clean, tools stored properly rather than scattered about. It spoke of discipline and pride in ownership, qualities she had come to associate with Pat himself. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. Pat had clearly made an effort to prepare for their visit. The floors were swept, a vase of wildflowers sat on the table, and fresh curtains hung in the windows. "Did you put up those curtains for my visit?" Harriet asked, touching the simple muslin fabric. Pat looked slightly embarrassed. "Asked Mrs. Miller to help with a few things. Wanted it to look welcoming." The thought of this self-sufficient man asking for help to make his home presentable for her touched Harriet deeply. She explored the cabin with genuine interest, noticing the small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, the quality of the handmade furniture, the care evident in every detail. While Alina helped herself to lemonade in the kitchen, Pat led Harriet to the porch. "Well?" he asked, his expression a mixture of hope and resignation. I know it's nothing like what you're used to." Harriet looked out at the vista before them, the rolling land, the distant mountains, the open sky. Then she turned to Pat, seeing the same strength and beauty in his face that she saw in the landscape. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It feels like a home." Relief washed over his features. "It could be," he said quietly. "Our home, if you wanted that." Though not a formal proposal, the meaning behind his words was clear. Harriet felt a certainty settle over her, a recognition that this place, this life, was what she had been seeking without knowing it. "I think I would like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. Pat's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He took her hand, his touch conveying promises that words alone could not express. They returned to town with a new understanding between them, though they agreed to proceed with propriety. The following week, Pat formally asked Harriet to marry him, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "It's not fancy," he apologized. "I could get something else if you'd prefer." "It's beautiful," Harriet assured him, slipping the ring onto her finger, "all the more precious for its history." Their engagement became the talk of Porterville, generally met with approval and good wishes. The school board, after some discussion, agreed that Harriet could continue teaching after her marriage, at least until a replacement could be found if she later chose to retire to domestic life. As spring blossomed into summer, preparations for their wedding occupied much of Harriet's free time. Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on hosting a proper celebration at the hotel, and the women of the town rallied to help with everything from decorations to food. Pat expanded the cabin, adding a larger bedroom and improving the kitchen with Harriet's comfort in mind. They were married on a perfect July morning in Porterville's small church, with Reverend Miller officiating. Harriet wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from San Francisco, while Pat looked uncommonly formal in a new black suit that clearly made him somewhat uncomfortable. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, and the celebration that followed, a testament to how quickly Harriet had become an integral part of the community. As the sun set on their wedding day, Pat drove Harriet home to their ranch in his wagon, now decorated with ribbons and good luck charms by the town's children. They traveled mostly in companionable silence, both aware of the significance of this journey not just to the ranch, but to their new life together. At the property boundary, Pat surprised Harriet by stopping the wagon. "There's a tradition," he explained, coming around to her side. "A husband is supposed to carry his bride across the threshold of their home." With that, he lifted her easily from the wagon seat, cradling her against his chest. "The threshold is still quite a distance away," Harriet pointed out, laughing as she looped her arms around his neck. Pat smiled, the expression transforming his face in the golden sunset light. "Then I'd better get started." As he carried her down the path toward their home, Harriet rested her head against his shoulder, marveling at the journey that had brought her here. From the cold desert night where she had nearly died to this moment of perfect contentment, it seemed almost impossible to reconcile. "What are you thinking?" Pat asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. "I was thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best," she replied. "If I hadn't been abandoned in the desert, we would never have met." Pat's arms tightened around her. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow. But I'm grateful every day that I found you when I did, where I did." At the cabin door, he paused, looking down at her with such love that Harriet felt breathless with the force of it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance." The simple words, spoken with such sincerity, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. "Home," she repeated, the word carrying all the meaning that had been missing from her life since her parents' deaths. "Yes, I believe it is." Pat carried her across the threshold into their home, into their future, leaving behind the cold desert night that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her a new one, unexpected, challenging, and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined in her old Boston life. Over the years that followed, their love deepened and grew, rooted in the shared experiences of frontier life. The small ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to include more cattle and better horses. Harriet continued teaching until their first child was born, a son they named Thomas after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and then another son, Michael, completing their family. The territory changed around them, becoming more settled as the railroad brought new people and opportunities. Porterville grew from a small frontier outpost to a proper town with brick buildings and boardwalks, replacing the dusty paths Harriet had first known. Through it all, she and Pat remained constants in each other's lives, partners in every sense of the word. Sometimes, on clear winter nights when the desert cold crept close to their warm home, Harriet would recall that terrible night when she had lain alone and dying under the stars. Then she would look at Pat beside her, at their children sleeping safely in their beds, at the life they had built together, and silently thank whatever fate or providence had guided him to find her in that vast emptiness. From abandonment had come rescue, from despair, hope, from the cold desert night, the warmth of enduring love. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the one she had been destined for, a life as boundless and beautiful as the western sky that stretched above their home, a testament to the unexpected journeys of the heart.